At 3:30 on December 7, 1941, a 23-year-old man from Awa, Tokushima, lowered himself into a steel cylinder 48 feet long and 3 feet wide, carrying orders to penetrate the harbor entrance at Pearl Harbor, fire 2 torpedoes at American battleships, and die. His name was Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki. He was a graduate of the 68th class of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy. He had been selected for this mission over hundreds of other candidates because his commanders judged him loyal, technically skilled, and committed to the warrior code that governed every man who wore the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The gyroscope on his midget submarine, designation HA-19, was broken. He knew it before he launched. His commanding officer knew it. He launched anyway. By midnight on December 7th, the 9 other Japanese submariners who had entered Pearl Harbor in 5 two-man midget submarines were dead. Their names would appear in school textbooks across Japan within months. They would receive posthumous double promotions. Monuments would be built in their honor. Songs would be written about them. They would be called the 9 heroes of Pearl Harbor. Sakamaki was not dead. American soldiers had found him unconscious on a beach in eastern Oahu, pulled him from the surf, and transported him to a hospital under armed guard. When he regained consciousness, his psychological state was one that no American military manual had prepared the guards for. He had survived a mission from which survival was not permitted. Under the code he carried, the fact of his survival was itself a form of failure. He requested that the Americans allow him to end his life in accordance with that code. The guards refused. He made the request again. They refused again. Kazuo Sakamaki had just become prisoner of war number 1, the first Japanese serviceman captured alive by American forces in the Second World War, and for reasons that had nothing to do with anything the Americans did to him, surviving Pearl Harbor was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. This is not a story about one man's shame. It is a story about the system that created it, codified it, institutionalized it, weaponized it, and sent it into battle with millions of Japanese soldiers who carried it in their breast pockets alongside photographs of their families. It is a story about what that system cost Japan in human lives, in strategic coherence, and in the lives of civilians who had never held a weapon. And it is a story that is documented with a precision that makes it possible to measure, in numbers that are specific and exact, exactly what the fear of surrender cost everyone it touched. To understand what Sakamaki faced in that hospital room in December 1941, you have to understand what Japan had done to itself in the 20 years before Pearl Harbor. The roots of the no-surrender doctrine were genuinely old. Japan had fought the Mongols in the 13th century. It had fought clan wars throughout the medieval period. In both cases, the killing of captives was standard. The samurai code of Bushido, as it existed in its original 18th century formulation, was actually more nuanced than its wartime interpretation. The great classic of Bushido, the Hagakure, written in the early 1700s, opened with the phrase, "Bushido is a way of dying." Its core argument was that a samurai who accepted the possibility of death at any moment could devote himself fully to his lord without the corruption of self-preservation. This was philosophy. It was not military policy. And in the early 20th century, Japan's treatment of enemy prisoners actually reflected a more moderate interpretation of that philosophy. During the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, Japan captured approximately 79,367 Russian prisoners. Under the terms of the 1899 Hague Convention, which Japan had ratified, those prisoners were treated in accordance with international standards. They were housed in camps across Japan, paid for labor they performed, and repatriated at the war's end. Japanese government documents from the period show the treatment was used as a deliberate propaganda tool, a demonstration that Japan had joined the community of civilized nations and could be trusted with responsibilities that Western powers had historically reserved for themselves. The treatment of prisoners was not compassion. It was strategy. And it worked. International observers commended Japan's conduct. The Japanese soldiers captured by Russia in that same war came home to a different reception. They returned from Russian prisoner of war camps to find themselves socially marginalized. Communities that had sent men to war expecting either victory or death received survivors with an ambivalence that hardened over time into something more explicit. The returned prisoners had not died. They had endured. Under the emerging interpretation of Bushido that was taking hold in Japanese military culture, endurance was not the virtue. Death was the virtue. The men who came home were a complication in a narrative that had no category for their existence. That institutional memory entered the military and never left. Between 1920 and 1940, Japanese military culture underwent a transformation that historians have documented with precision. The military code that had permitted surrender under impossible circumstances was progressively tightened. In 1928, the Imperial Japanese Army published a revised edition of its core strategic doctrine. The editors made a specific and deliberate decision. They removed 3 words from the text: defense, retreat, and surrender. The official rationale was that such words were detrimental to the martial spirit of the Japanese soldier. The practical effect was that an army of millions trained on doctrine from which the concept of tactical withdrawal had been literally excised. The 1908 Imperial Japanese Army Criminal Code had already contained a provision making surrender a capital offense for commanders. A commanding officer who allowed his unit to surrender without fighting to the last man faced death, regardless of the tactical circumstances that had made further resistance impossible. The provision attracted little attention at the time of its passage. It would shape the outcomes of hundreds of battles 35 years later. But the codification that would define the Pacific War came on January 8, 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, 6 months before the first American soldier would know what the document contained. War Minister Hideki Tojo authorized the printing and distribution of a pocket-sized document to every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army. The document was called the Senjinkun, the Field Service Code. Every man in uniform received a physical copy. The document covered military regulations, combat readiness, esprit de corps, the veneration of Shinto gods, and loyalty to the emperor. Under the heading Honor, in Section 8, it contained the sentence that would echo across every Pacific island, every jungle, every cave, and every cliff for the next 4 years. The exact translation from the Japanese reads, "If alive, do not suffer the disgrace of becoming a prisoner. In death, do not leave behind a name soiled by misdeeds." 8 words in the original Japanese, not a suggestion, not a philosophical aspiration, an explicit prohibition backed by criminal law, amplified by the most comprehensive propaganda campaign in modern Japanese history, enforced by the threat of consequences, extending not just to the soldier himself, but to everyone connected to him. The Senjinkun's release was not quiet. It was accompanied by a full national propaganda campaign. A phonograph recording called The Song of the Senjinkun was produced and broadcast on national radio. The document was distributed not just to soldiers, but to schools, workplaces, community organizations, and households. Japan's state-controlled media system produced newspapers, films, broadcasts, and school lessons built around the document's central message. Surrender was not merely dishonorable. It was a crime against the nation, a betrayal of the emperor who was a living deity, a stain that would fall permanently on the surrendering soldier, his parents, his children, his name for generations. A 24-page manual accompanied training for frontline soldiers. The manual told them explicitly that even if they were captured because they were starving, out of ammunition, wounded, or unconscious, that was no excuse. Their duty was to fight, escape, or accept death. There was no fourth option in the manual, because there was no fourth option in the doctrine. The Japanese soldier going to war in the Pacific in December 1941 carried the Senjinkun in his breast pocket. He also carried a second piece of indoctrination, built by the same propaganda machine over the same years. If he was captured, the Americans would torture him. This was not speculation or rumor. It was explicit instruction, delivered in training, repeated in unit briefings, reinforced by propaganda materials that described American and British forces as brutal and uncivilized. The soldiers were told they would be killed in captivity. They were told this so consistently and so authoritatively that the vast majority of Japanese soldiers believed it with the same certainty they believed the Senjinkun itself. It was factually false. This would be documented in extraordinary detail by the American military interrogation records of thousands of Japanese prisoners who discovered, to their confusion and psychological dislocation, that their captors offered them cigarettes, warm food, and medical treatment. The lie had been constructed so comprehensively that its exposure in practice could not undo it in theory. Men who had been captured and treated humanely still reported in their later testimony that they had expected the worst. The conditioning went that deep. The practical result of the Senjinkun and its supporting apparatus was measurable in the battlefield statistics of every major Pacific engagement, beginning with the first. In the European theatre of the same war, German surrender rates were substantial from the beginning and increased as the war progressed. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, approximately 4,000 American soldiers were captured by German forces in 3 days. At the Falaise Pocket in France in August 1944, approximately 50,000 German soldiers surrendered to Allied forces in a single 2-week operation. By the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were being processed through Allied prisoner-of-war camps monthly. This was not cowardice. It was the rational response of trained military men to tactical situations where further resistance was impossible and offered no military value. The German military code permitted and regulated surrender under those circumstances. Soldiers who surrendered when resistance was futile were not criminals in German military law. In the Pacific Theatre, the numbers produced by the same calculation tell a fundamentally different story. Of approximately 2.1 million Japanese soldiers who died in the Pacific War, the overwhelming majority died in combat or from disease and starvation while continuing to resist capture. The Japanese government's own wartime records documented that approximately 42,000 Japanese military personnel were captured by American and Australian forces across the entire war. That is roughly 2% of the soldiers who fought. The Americans captured as many German soldiers in a single week during the final months of the European campaign as they captured Japanese soldiers in 4 years of Pacific fighting. The contrast became specific enough to be given a name. After the Battle of Saipan in July 1944, a joint Chiefs of Staff planning document coined the term the Saipan ratio and stated that it would take approximately 1 American killed and several wounded to eliminate 7 Japanese soldiers. The ratio was not a measure of relative battlefield skill. It was a measure of the difference between an army that could surrender when tactically defeated and an army that could not. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 illustrates the mathematics precisely. American Marines stormed the atoll of Betio, defended by approximately 4,500 Japanese soldiers and Korean laborers. After 76 hours of fighting that Marine veterans described as the most intense they had ever experienced, 4,690 of the defenders were dead. 17 Japanese soldiers were captured alive. 17. From a garrison of 4,500. Of the 4,690 who died, hundreds had survived the battle itself. They chose death over capture in those final hours, in every case documented by the American forces who advanced across the island. At the Battle of Saipan in June and July 1944, see approximately 29,000 Japanese soldiers died. American forces captured approximately 1,780. In the final days of the battle, Japanese Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito gathered his surviving officers in a cave near the island's northern shore. His orders were consistent with the Senjinkun he carried. He directed a final charge. He then took his own life in accordance with the code. His body was buried by American soldiers with military honors. On July 7, 1944, 2 days before Saipan was declared secure, approximately 4,300 Japanese soldiers conducted what became the largest mass charge of the entire Pacific War. They came in the darkness, and American soldiers and Marines at the 27th Infantry Division's lines could hear them approaching before contact. They came in their thousands against prepared American positions. When it was over, 4,311 Japanese soldiers were dead. American casualties were nearly 1,000, including 406 killed, primarily from the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, who bore the weight of the assault. Both battalion commanders were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But the Senjinkun had not been designed only for soldiers. And on Saipan, for the first time in the Pacific War on a large scale, American forces witnessed what it produced when it reached civilians. Thousands of Japanese civilians had settled on Saipan during the island's decades under Japanese administration. They had built farms, raised families, established communities. They were ordinary people with no military training and no tactical function in the island's defense. As American forces advanced north across the island, these civilians retreated with the military toward the northern cliffs. American forces dropped leaflets in Japanese. They deployed loudspeakers broadcasting appeals in the civilian population's language. They brought captured Japanese civilians to the speakers to make those appeals personally, to say in familiar voices that Americans would not harm them. Some civilians responded. Some came down from the cliffs. Others chose what the Senjinkun had defined as the only honorable alternative. At the northern promontory of Saipan, at the locations American forces would name Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, hundreds of Japanese civilians chose death over the possibility of capture. The precise number has never been established. Estimates range from 800 to over 1,000. American soldiers watching from below could do nothing. They had shouted assurances upward and been unable to penetrate 20 years of conditioning that no loudspeaker could undo in an afternoon. The Senjinkun had been written for soldiers. It had been distributed to an entire society. When that society faced the situation the document described, the document produced its intended response in people who had never been issued a uniform. Kazuo Sakamaki spent the 4 years between Pearl Harbor and the end of the war moving through American prisoner of war camps. Hawaii, San Francisco, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas, Washington State. The transfers were routine administrative procedure. From Sakamaki's perspective, documented in the memoir he would eventually write, each transfer was a further period of isolation inside a situation the Senjinkun had told him did not exist and could not be survived with honor. While Sakamaki was alive in American custody, the 9 submariners who had died were being constructed into myth. The Japanese propaganda apparatus had the material it needed. 9 men had gone to their deaths. 1 had not. The 9 became the 9 heroes of Pearl Harbor, elevated immediately to the status of national martyrs. Posthumous double promotions, state ceremonies, monuments, songs, school lessons built around their example. Their names and faces in newspapers across Japan. Sakamaki's name did not appear in any of this. The Japanese government's Prisoner of War Information Bureau, established on December 27, 1941, received the communication from American forces through Red Cross channels, confirming his capture. The Bureau catalogued the information. It did not pass it to his family. When family members wrote to inquire about his status, the Bureau's response neither confirmed nor denied that he was a prisoner. This was consistent with the position stated publicly by Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru in 1943. Our army maintains the position that Japanese prisoners of war do not exist. Sakamaki did not exist. He was stricken from official records. His submarine, captured intact and in functional condition on the beach at Waimanalo, was taken on a nationwide American tour as a war bond recruiting tool. The Japanese government's propaganda presented it as a vessel lost in heroic combat at the bottom of the harbor. The system that produced this outcome had additional practical effects that its designers had not fully anticipated. The Senjinkun had created a situation that was tactically useful to the Americans in ways the Japanese Navy and Army could not have predicted when they issued the document. The logic of the Senjinkun dictated that the Imperial Japanese Army did not train soldiers in post-surrender behavior. If you were not supposed to survive, there was no need for instructions about what to do after survival. Japanese soldiers received no training equivalent to the American and British standard of providing only name, rank, and service number to interrogators. The concept of prisoner rights under the Geneva Convention was entirely absent from their education, not because the Japanese military was unaware of the convention, but because the convention governed a situation that the Senjinkun declared impossible. When a Japanese soldier was captured and found himself alive in an American facility, the entire ideological framework he had been given to interpret his situation collapsed. He was alive. He had surrendered. He was therefore already dishonored beyond recovery in the terms his culture had given him. What remained to protect? American interrogators working with Japanese prisoners documented in systematic reports what happened next. Japanese prisoners, confronted with warm food, medical treatment, and basic human courtesy, experienced a psychological dislocation that left them without the structures they would have needed to maintain operational security. Many talked freely, not under coercion. In a state of profound psychological confusion in which the rules that governed their behavior had been rendered inapplicable by a situation those rules said should not exist. The intelligence produced by these interrogations was operationally significant throughout the Pacific War. Positions of unit deployments, supply routes, fleet movements, defensive plans, tunnel networks on specific islands. The Japanese military had constructed its operational security around the absolute certainty that its soldiers would not be available for interrogation. That certainty was wrong by approximately 42,000 men. Those 42,000 men, conditioned to believe that nothing they said mattered because they were already effectively dead in the terms of the code, provided Allied intelligence with information that shaped operations from Guadalcanal to the final preparations for the invasion of Japan itself. The Senjinkun was a pocket-sized document. It fit in a breast pocket with room for a photograph. It removed Japanese soldiers from the battlefield. It provided Allied intelligence with a systematic advantage because its own logic made counterintelligence training unnecessary for soldiers who were not supposed to be interrogated because they were not supposed to exist as prisoners. The American response to the tactical reality of the Senjinkun developed over the war's first 3 years into a psychological warfare program of considerable sophistication. The leaflets dropped over Japanese positions were developed after careful study of the Senjinkun's specific vocabulary of honor and shame. Early leaflets that used the word surrender in Japanese were almost universally ineffective. The Japanese words for surrender carried connotations of moral descent, of going from high to low, that activated exactly the shame response the Senjinkun had constructed. Allied psychological warfare specialists developed alternative phrasing. Cease resistance. Stop fighting. Come forward. Language that offered a path without requiring the full vocabulary of dishonor that the Senjinkun had made inescapable. Some leaflets promised explicitly that the Japanese government would not be notified of the capture. This promise aligned with how American forces actually treated Japanese prisoners. But the accuracy of the promise was irrelevant to men who had been told for years by the same authority that now issued surrender leaflets that Americans did not take prisoners. The gap between what the leaflets said and what the Senjinkun had established required something the leaflets alone could not provide. The man who found the most effective way through these barriers was a 19-year-old Marine private named Guy Gabaldon. He had grown up in East Los Angeles in a Japanese-American neighborhood, had been informally adopted by a Japanese-American family as a teenager, and spoke Japanese fluently. During the Battle of Saipan, Gabaldon began conducting unauthorized solo operations that his commanding officers initially wanted to court-martial him for. He would leave American lines alone at night, locate Japanese positions, caves, and fortified structures, and approach them in darkness, speaking Japanese, addressing the soldiers and civilians inside in their own language. His approach was not surrender requests in the Allied textbook sense. He acknowledged the code that governed them. He spoke within the framework of Bushido rather than against it, finding formulations that allowed compliance to be understood as serving the emperor's actual interests rather than betraying them. He argued that Japan needed living soldiers more than it needed soldiers who died without purpose, that their duty to their families, which the Senjinkun itself invoked, was better fulfilled by survival than by death in a cave on a Pacific island no one would remember. Over the course of the Saipan campaign, Gabaldon personally secured the surrender of between 1,300 and 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians, more than any individual combatant in American military history. He did it primarily alone and primarily unarmed during the actual negotiations. The disparity between what he achieved and what standard Allied operations had assumed was possible against Senjinkun conditioned soldiers was itself a measure of the document's construction. It had been designed so thoroughly that breaching it required someone who understood the internal logic precisely enough to find the gaps. Gabaldon's Navy Cross was eventually upgraded to recognize the full scope of what he had done. The upgrade came 61 years after the battle. The Senjinkun's effects at the Battle of Okinawa in April through June 1945 produced data that allowed for a direct measurement of the document's reach into populations with varying levels of indoctrination. Okinawa's defensive force included large numbers of recently conscripted Home Guard units who had not received the same comprehensive conditioning as regular Imperial Army personnel. These men had been civilians more recently. The Senjinkun's hold was shallower in them. During the battle, approximately 11,250 Japanese military personnel and unarmed laborers surrendered, representing 12% of the defensive force. By the standards of any Pacific battle before Okinawa, this was remarkable. By the standards of the European theatre, it was still catastrophically small. The difference between a man conditioned for 4 years and a man conditioned for 4 months was measurable in whether he walked toward American lines or did not. The civilian experience on Okinawa during the battle's final weeks reflected the same mechanisms that had operated on Saipan, extended over a larger population and a longer period. Approximately 1/3 of Okinawa's entire civilian population died during the campaign. Some died from the direct effects of combat operations on both sides. Others died from disease and starvation in the battle's aftermath. A significant portion died because the same cultural and military framework that had defined surrender as worse than death for soldiers had been extended to civilians who had never been soldiers. Okinawan survivors who testified after the battle described military officers instructing civilian groups that resistance to capture was required of them as surely as it was required of soldiers. The phrase "implement the field service code" appeared in testimony from multiple separate locations on the island, delivered by multiple separate military officers to civilian groups who had never taken a military oath. The Senjinkun had been written for soldiers. On Okinawa, it was applied by military officers to farmers and teachers and their children. The number of Okinawan civilians who died because of this application has never been precisely established. Historians estimate the figure in the tens of thousands. In May 1945, as the Battle of Okinawa was entering its final weeks, American military planners were working on the operational estimates for the invasion of Japan itself. The Senjinkun was central to every calculation they made. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, was projected to produce American casualties between 250,000 and 1 million killed and wounded, with Japanese military and civilian casualties potentially reaching several million. The projections were built on the casualty ratios documented in every previous Pacific battle and on the explicit statements of Japanese military commanders about their intentions for the defense of the homeland. The Senjinkun had constructed a defensive situation that American planners found unprecedented in modern warfare, a society in which the prohibition against surrender extended across both the military and civilian populations, in which the enemy force could not be rationally expected to cease resistance at any level of tactical defeat, short of physical annihilation. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, killed approximately 110,000 to 210,000 people in the explosions and their immediate aftermath. The decision to use them was made by men who had watched the casualty projections accumulate through 4 years of Pacific fighting against an army the Senjinkun had made impossible to defeat by attrition in any time frame compatible with political survival at home. The causal chain from the pocket-sized document issued to Japanese soldiers in January 1941 to the 2 atomic bombings 4.5 years later runs through the casualty statistics of Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa with a directness that historians have documented and debated for 80 years. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, did not use the word surrender. His speech described Japan's capitulation as enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable. The passive construction was deliberate. The architects of the broadcast understood that the word surrender, in the vocabulary the Senjinkun had spent 4 years constructing, could not appear in the emperor's mouth without creating a crisis in the millions of soldiers still under arms who had been taught that the word described a crime. Even after the broadcast, the system produced its characteristic response in men who had been most thoroughly processed by it. On Lubang Island in the Philippines, 2nd Lieutenant Hiru Onoda heard the broadcast and concluded it was American propaganda. He continued his mission for 29 more years. On Guam, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi found an Allied leaflet in 1952 describing the war's end and concluded it was a deception. He remained in hiding for 20 more years after that. On Morotai Island in Indonesia, Private Teruo Nakamura kept his position until Indonesian soldiers surrounded his camp in December 1974, 30 years after the battle that had stranded him there. None of these men were irrational. Each of them had been told by the most authoritative sources available that surrender was a crime, that their families would be shamed by their capture, that Allied claims of Japan's defeat were propaganda designed to lure Japanese soldiers into exposing themselves, and that the emperor required their continued service until ordered otherwise. When information arrived that contradicted these teachings, the teachings provided an explanation for the contradiction. The leaflets were propaganda. The radio broadcast was a deception. The documents were forgeries. The system was comprehensive enough that its own counter-evidence could be reinterpreted as additional confirmation. Kazuo Sakamaki returned to Japan in January 1946. The country he returned to had been physically devastated, its major cities reduced to rubble, its 2 industrial centers destroyed by weapons that had no precedent in human experience. The reception it gave him was not the reception it had given the men who died. He wrote a memoir. He called it 4 Years as a Prisoner of War, No. 1. The title was both his designation in American records and his verdict on himself in Japanese cultural terms. He was not the hero of the story he was telling. He was a number, the first proof that the Senjinkun's most absolute prohibition could be violated and that the violation could be survived. The memoir was not warmly received. Sakamaki spent the subsequent decades working for Toyota, eventually running the company's Brazilian operations. He declined nearly all interviews and press inquiries. He avoided public appearances related to the war. His family did not release news of his death in November 1999 for nearly a month. He had spent his entire post-war life preferring the privacy that Japan's culture of shame had made necessary. In 1991, 50 years after Pearl Harbor, he returned to Texas for a conference. He encountered his midget submarine for the first time since the beach at Waimanalo. The Americans had captured it intact. They had toured it across the country as a war bond prop. They had eventually donated it to the Admiral Nimitz Pacific War Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, where it sat in a display case. When Sakamaki saw it, He broke down in tears. He had been unconscious when he left it on that beach. He had not seen it in 50 years. The submarine that he had been supposed to die with, which had refused to cooperate with the Senjinkun's requirements, as existed in a glass case in Texas as evidence that the prohibition had been violated and that violations could survive. His submarine is still in Texas. The 9 men who died on December 7th are in Japanese monuments and school textbooks. Sakamaki is in a footnote. The Senjinkun was formally repudiated by the post-war Japanese government. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes trials held between 1946 and 1948, examined the document's role in shaping the treatment of Allied prisoners of war. The men who administered the camps where American prisoners died at rates 40 times higher than those in German camps had been trained by the same document that told them their own surrender was a crime. The contempt the code created for anyone who chose to live over dying extended outward with a consistency the trials documented in case after case across the Pacific Theater. The system that produced Saipan's northern cliffs, that kept Hiru Onoda fighting alone in the Philippine jungle until 1974, that left Kazuo Sakamaki requesting death in a hospital room on Sand Island in December 1941, was not an accident of culture. It was a document. January 8, 1941. Pocket-sized. Issued to every man in uniform. 8 words under the heading Honor. If alive, do not suffer the disgrace of becoming a prisoner. The men who wrote those words were thinking about soldiers on battlefields. They were not thinking about a young woman standing at the edge of a northern cliff on Saipan in July 1944. Choosing what the Senjinkun had defined as the only honorable path. They were not thinking about a 56-year-old man setting shrimp traps in a Guam river in January 1972, still holding his position because the war was still happening in the only place it had never ended, inside the framework, built by 8 words that fit in a breast pocket, alongside a photograph of a family he had not seen in 28 years. They were not thinking about a 23-year-old ensign regaining consciousness in a hospital room in Hawaii in December 1941, asking American soldiers for the means to correct an outcome that a broken gyroscope had made impossible to avoid. What they were thinking about was documented clearly enough. They wanted soldiers who would not surrender. They got them. In numbers, no army in the history of modern warfare has matched before or since. It cost what it cost. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Also, drop your comment here below and tell us where you are watching from. Now click on this next video. See you there.